contributors. I want to particularly thank our sponsors, and that's Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Associated British Ports, and Talk Talk. You will hear from them all later and throughout the day. And thank you so much for your support and actually making this really important day possible. So what's going to happen today? I'll just give you a quick run through. I'll be chairing Plenary 1 on how do we reboot and rebuild the Northern Powerhouse. Big question. And Henry Morrison, Director of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, will be chairing Plenary 2 on how do we rebalance and recover in the North. After a short lunch break, you can join Henry and the Right Honourable Andy Burnham, Greater Manchester Mayor, in conversation with 3 young Northerners, talking about the challenges and plans and for jobs and skills in the future and in the North now. This afternoon we have 2 mini summits running concurrently. Mini Summit 1, again you'll see 2 more Metro mayors, Louise, Ben Lucas, all people you know, Beth Farhout, and Jamie Driscoll, Neil McEnroy. So fantastic lineup there, looking at what does the North need to build back better. So that's a great session, and lots of all have already signed up. Mini Summit 2 this afternoon, you'll see we've got Lord Michael Heseltine, Sarah Longlongs from the IPPR, TFN, one of my fellow commuters, Tim Wood, and the Association of British Ports, Stafford Williams, and Dan Fell from the Doncaster Chamber of Commerce. And I think I've missed somebody off the end, but that will be because I can't see them. Anyway, so those are 2 fantastic. If you haven't already booked on a mini summit, these are great. So you can still register via Eventbrite. You know, registration closes at 12, and you will then be sent a link. So let me just quickly, very quickly, so how's this going to run? A few housekeeping tips. Basically, all very simple, nothing to be alarmed of. I think you're all very well practiced in this virtual world we now live in. Hashtag NPEESS 2020, which I've already said, and tag @DevoConnect so we can keep the conversation going online. If you want to contribute, I want to make this as interactive as possible, but use the raise hand function. And if you could all make sure panelists are on mute and to unmute your microphones when you want to speak, that would help in this world. So let's get started. As I've already said, the scale of and the challenge ahead is huge. Deep recession looms, and the UK faces record unemployment. The Northern economy will be hard hit and see prevailing inequalities deepen. Government promises to reboot and level up the Northern economy are welcome, but in the new post-COVID-19 normal, if there is a normal, does the North really need to boost, what does the North need to boost prosperity, unlock innovation and rebuild? So the key questions we're asking in this session are how do we reboot and rebuild the Northern Step? That is the core question we are tackling in this plenary. But largely, let's have a look also at questions like, what does the North need to accelerate recovery, rebuild the Northern Powerhouse economy today and for tomorrow? And would a more devolved pan-Northern regional response reboot and rebalance the labour market and build back better? So, here to help us answer these very big questions and give us their views are our wonderful and illustrious panel. I'm delighted to welcome Lord Jim O'Neill, Vice Chair of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, amongst other things, and Councillor Judith Blake from leader of Leeds City Council and Chair of UK Core Cities. Also Dame Carolyn Fairbairn from the CBI, who, if you haven't read the Yorkshire Post, has run a very good piece this morning. And last but not least, we have Simon Simon Clarke, who's also known as the Northern Powerhouse Minister. So I think you'll agree, I'm itching to hear what they've all got to say. We'll then bring in, of course, Simon Bird and Tristia Harrison from Talk, who will be their first people to respond. And then you all join in. So without further ado, can I welcome Jim O'Neill, Lord Jim O'Neill of Gatley, a very good Manchester bloke, and really good to have you on the line. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Jill. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. Wave your hand, Jill, if you can't. You can, right? Okay, good. It's incredible to hear you say at the start, the event that we had in Leeds just over 2 years ago, it certainly does seem a pretty long time since then. And in the brief remarks I'll make, it seems to me this crisis has heightened the relative importance of the exact topic on this agenda of all the issues that are relevant for the success of the Northern Powerhouse compared to some others. And so I hope collectively and in the middle of it, government is going to be doing more to deliver on it. So let me get right to it. I'll say about 6 comments and I'll stop. The first one of which is the context of COVID-19. And in many ways, it's, and it will flow through with other comments, it sort of highlights, in my opinion, the national productivity dilemma of the UK. As well as the regional disparities on it. I know some of the people on this call, including some of this panel, have heard me say this before in recent weeks, but I've been heavily focused on a global basis looking at a number of aspects of this, and whilst one has to be careful comparing countries, what has been striking since the start of it, with some notable exceptions, very few, most of the countries that have coped better with this pandemic, especially with the health response, but also to some degree as more data emerges as some countries come out of it with the economic consequences, are typically those countries historically that score the highest on independent indicators about sustainable growth and high productivity. And in that sense, I'm afraid to say it's not that surprising how the UK has coped, because it would be consistent with its relatively low performance and measure on such indicators. I created one for over 180 countries in my many years when I was head of research at Goldman Sachs, and there are many other such indicators, the United Nations being amongst the most prominent ones, and the relative performances are all pretty consistent. So in that sense, aspects of the UK's disappointing performance are not, in my view, sadly, that surprising. And what it should do is highlight even more the importance of a number of issues that relate to our enormous productivity challenge. Second thing to say with that in mind, and now turning specifically to the North, a lot of people also know that I've frequently talked about 6 different broad areas of where success on each of them are all individually necessary components for the long-term success of the Northern Powerhouse. And I would argue, linked to my first point, and some of the areas where the UK has struggled through this crisis are ones that are absolutely even more important than they were before, and certainly relative to some others. And they would be, in my opinion, education and skills, technology and communications, and housing, perhaps in particular, social housing. And in my view, the importance of more intense focus on solving those dilemmas as it relates to the Northern Powerhouse are even bigger than they were before this crisis. And as I emphasize, in my view, relatively more than they were to other things such as much discussed transport issues, which obviously do remain extremely important, but in my view are not actually as important as those things I've just said. Thirdly, in that regard, I'd put devolution right in the middle of them. Many of these things that I've highlighted cannot be successfully achieved by some kind of diktat from Westminster and Whitehall. If you just look at the considerable challenges the country has had with track and tracing, that is a perfect illustration of how properly administered and responsibly taken devolved policies should work. And it's very pleasing in that regard that just before the crisis hits, we had the beginnings, and I know Judith is on this panel, she might touch on it, but the beginnings of the development of more steps on devolved policies for some regions, and I'm particularly delighted that West Yorkshire is now at the forefront of this agenda, and I think it's very important that others get involved, and crucially, those parts of the north have already had a devolved administration with mayoral leaders actually get quite a lot more policies too, and this shouldn't just be seen as some sort of one-off set of measures, but a permanent set of policies that get bigger and more ambitious as we go forward. And I would include education, skills, housing, and technology within those. And I'd like to emphasize as my fourth point in that regard, and speaking as candidly as I always do, in my view, the Department of Education has been a laggard in its commitments to aspects of the Northern Powerhouse agenda, including devolution. And it's very important that the Prime Minister instructs the Department of Education that they have to treat this more seriously if there is a genuine levelling up policy. Fifthly, in that regard, and here I'm going to highlight the work of Henry Murison and the team at the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, along with a number of others, and actually some national figures, including the chairman of the Education Select Committee, deserve credit for this. Specifically, as it relates to education and skills, there are three things that I would like to see. The so-called catch-up premium that that group has been so powerful in influencing the Department of Education on, partially so far during the summer with their additional $1 billion funding, but we need more on that and for it to be permanent. Secondly, and there are signs of this emerging also, which is good, a much more serious approach to further education colleges, which would be a lot more applicable to the kind of modern skills challenges that are true for the whole country, but certainly specifically for the North. And then thirdly, within this category, so-called opportunity areas, in my opinion, to really deal with the deep challenges of the very localized, considerable number of areas of being left behind within the North. The nascent approach to opportunity areas that was developed some years ago that includes the likes of Blackpool and Bradford and a number of other places, rather than being wound down, which is the sort of overriding impression one sort of gets, we should be doing more of these and they should be more focused and more ambitious. And while they should certainly have education at their heart, should consider bringing in other forms of intervention, including aspects of startup businesses, to help these places get out of this lifelong or generationally beyond one generational long a vicious circle of lack of opportunity, lack of ambition, and in order to help them take the Northern Powerhouse to where it should be. And we need a lot more of those, and a lot more targeted and to be treated a lot more seriously by our policymakers. And that's the core of what I'd like to say. And it seems to me, as you've highlighted yourself, Jill, it's pretty important that everybody realises that if the levelling up agenda was important before, the COVID-19 pandemic has made it even more important and should be for the government. And in that regard, I noticed the broader question that you had on the frame there was as to whether there should be a more pan-northern approach to some of this. I think it has to be both more specifically targeted along the lines of what I've said, involving greater powers for devolved areas within the North, as well as opportunity areas. But I do believe there is a case for, in addition, to have a fresh approach to certain pan-North aspects. And as I'm sure many people have seen my name involved in repeatedly, the idea of what is known in the world of business as so-called patient capital, in which the government is a provider of long-term equity-based finance to focus on investments in the true natural assets of the North, such as alternative energies and advanced manufacturing, digital and life sciences, is an incredible opportunity that this crisis has thrown up for the government to help be at the core of, and it's something I would love to see. And with that, let me stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. That was fantastic, as always, and always thought-provoking stuff. I think today very much is really to gather those minds together, and if we can, at some point today, or as an output of today, to actually come up with maybe an action plan or a new deal ask for the North across that. And getting those ideas are really important. I'm going to now go across to the Pennines, because I'm in Manchester, and Judith Blake is with us in Leeds. So Judith, obviously to give a local perspective, really, of how it's been for you, but also to really look at take forward some of those ideas about where we go from here in terms of rebalancing and recovering, and the importance of education, skills and employment moving forward. So Judith, welcome.
Thank you, Jill, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning, and obviously following on from Jim, lots of threads coming together, and I hope that when we get to the end of the panel we'll have a very rich picture from all different dimensions in terms of what we need to do to move us forward. And of course, it absolutely goes without saying, but that the economic crisis we're facing is without precedent, and really that real sense of, if we don't all pull together at this moment, that we will be looking at the potential for a lost generation coming through the recession. And my heart goes out to those young people who haven't had the closure of their normal full-time education, and we're really concerned to make sure that nobody feels left out, but it has been an incredibly difficult and challenging time across all parts of the education community. I think the thread that I'd like to pick up on is the need for us all to be ambitious. We can't just sit back and think business as usual. This has got to be different. And I think, looking back to the last economic shock that we had, 2007, 8, 9, the real difference, and where we've made enormous progress, is that we now talk about inclusive growth and sustainability, and all of those issues that relate very carefully to the individual needs of the people that we're talking about. That dimension has been left out too much, in my view, and has led to some of the failures, if you like, in actually addressing the real core problems that we face. I would just like to say that obviously we're hearing the announcements of the shovel-ready schemes coming out this week. We had the one on flooding yesterday. There'll be more this week. But I think it's that need for boldness that we need from the Prime Minister. So we need him to commit to HS2 East, for example. We need that commitment to unlocking the additional 150,000 jobs that we know, linking Leeds through South Yorkshire down to the East Midlands and West Midlands. We reckon that area alone has seen a 58 billion shortfall in infrastructure funding over the past decade when compared to London. And it's now that we need to see this rebalancing actually happening. But we can't just look at business as usual. So what we're asking for is a stimulus package for growth that will secure new jobs by targeting investment in key sectors. But most of all, making sure that the spatial inequalities in our towns and cities are linked with parallel investment in skills alongside all of the local community work, building on the social activism that has been unleashed during the progress of the pandemic. So we need to talk about levelling up still, of course, but we really need to build in resilience. We need the digital revolution that we've talked about so long, and we need to make sure that decarbonising is absolutely central to all of the work that we take forward, so that we can really start to address the underlying structural issues and the economic disparity in the region, as Jim says, with classic low productivity and educational disadvantage. And I really welcome the work that the Northern Powerhouse is doing, bringing so many different people together. But I have to stress at this point, Jill, that it's local government that is going to help move this forward. And our response to the pandemic has been without parallel, and we would be in such a bad place if it hadn't been for the incredible response from local governments. And in Leeds alone, we've paid out more than £142 million in grants to over 11,500 businesses. We've worked with nearly 20,000 shielded residents, 36,000 food parcels delivered, 34,500 free school meals provided to children across the city. And we need to make sure the experience with the terrible situation of the lack of PPE, that we really do start to look to our local supply chains and actually work with businesses that already exist in our communities that seem to I'm afraid, were ignored, to some degree through the national response. And of course, what we have to accept is that we have to learn to live with the virus. And it's the public health dimension of the recovery that we need to really make sure that we focus on. And we're all working to our local outbreak control plans and working with the NHS Test and Trace. But as we've heard only this week, we are talking about the potential of a second spike. And I would just say how awful and ironic it would be if we're facing the second spike at the same time that local authorities are having to make redundancies in their frontline services because we're not getting the support we need from government, the support that was promised. This has to be taken seriously. Otherwise, the winter ahead will be a very, very bleak place for our communities. So we know that the pandemic highlighted all of those issues that we raised that have really blighted the North. Health inequalities, one, learning disadvantage, of course, another. So many issues in our communities that have really borne the impact of the virus and are going to take a long time to recover it. So our work is even more important to address those issues. So I would just echo Jim's point about devolution. I would say now that the Department for Education is probably the most centralised department in government. They need to wake up to all the evidence that we've gathered, that where we devolve work through our growth deals down to local areas, our performance has outstripped the national programmes so significantly. It really can't be ignored any longer. And I think they have to wake up to just how important it is that we move at pace on this agenda. And it isn't just about adult skills. It's working right through into our school system, our education system at all levels, and really also picking up early intervention as well. So I would really like to welcome the focus on the under 25s in the plan for jobs, of course, and this needs to be really worked up and celebrated. But I think my regret is that there isn't enough focus on the over 25s and the need that we have to reskill and retrain. And we need to get back to the programs around lifelong learning. Otherwise, we're not going to come through this this real shock facing our economies. And of course, FE needs to be at the centre of this work, linking into HE as well. But it's the work-based programs that we need to strengthen and encourage. So I'm very pleased to tell everyone about the work that we're doing in Leeds around our Leeds Anchors network, and I would encourage everyone to look at this and see what we're doing. So the Leeds Anchors network is working with over 57,000 employees, and I'm very proud to say that 10 of our anchor institutions, these are the really significant employers in the city, are now living wage employers and really committed to best practice and really addressing some of the inequalities that we've highlighted this far. So whilst we are in an immediate recovery phase at the moment, I look forward to the discussions today, whilst we're all obviously focusing on the short and medium term impacts, but let's get together now and really start to look at the longer term inventions so that we can really power charge the Northern economy in a way that the Northern Powerhouse Partnership has been discussing for such a significant amount of time. Now is the time for action and making sure that we move forward in the way that we need to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Sorry, I just had a bit of a light bulb moment here, but it's all sorted now, back in the dark. So I think that was fantastic, and I'm really pleased that you put forward those really, you know, the actual, it's so important, local government and the challenges ahead in terms of that response. You know, it's not resolved, so it's a big job, and we do really, and looking at Simon Clark, who's joined us on the panel, I'm sure you'll have something to say in response to Judith, because I think it's so important that you know, that local and regional recovery. If there is a second spike, and some people say it'll even be worse, you know, how, you know, it begs too many issues. But you know, if we are going to rebuild and reboot, we do know that local government is so important to that recovery. And building on what Jim said, is that partnership and collaboration that today is all about, is building that. And so that's my segue in to introduce Dame Carolyn Fairbairn from the CBI, who's going to tell us more about her thoughts on how to rebuild and reboot the North, and obviously from the business part of the perspective and what the CBI is actually advocating. So over to you, Caroline.
Well, Jill, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this incredibly important conversation. Yes, I just want to set out a few priorities from business about how we reboot the North. You might have seen from my piece in the Yorkshire Post this morning how incredibly supportive we are of the power of region, the power of place. And Judith and I have had the opportunity to speak on platforms together a little bit over the past few weeks, and I want to echo her words about the power of collaboration. And I think if we can pick some real sort of rays of hope from the pandemic, it has been the response of collaboration on the ground that has really made a difference. But I do think that, and we at the CBI believe that we are at a moment of absolute maximum jeopardy for the economy at the moment, as the furlough scheme comes to an end and as unemployment begins to rise. And this feels like an extraordinarily important moment for the North to grab the opportunities of building back better, but also to get ahead of that unemployment curve that could be so scarring for the region. So what I want to do is set out the 5 priorities from business that we believe would be most powerful in helping to reboot and re-energize the North. And they are all focused on this idea of flattening the unemployment curve. We are all familiar with the curve of the virus. Following very closely in its wake is an unemployment curve of exceptional proportions, joblessness that we won't have seen since the 1980s. But we as the CBI believe that we can get ahead of it. The reasons for really focusing on unemployment, I think, are well known. But I would just reiterate this tremendous concern I think we should all share for young people. We do know that for younger age groups, if you enter into the workforce in the midst of a crisis, you are affected for life. We know that from the financial crisis. So we share that, I think, great responsibility to flatten that unemployment curve through this partnership that we can have across local and national government. So 5 quick priorities, and then I will end with a clarion call, if I may, for devolution to really work, and for business, I mean, we pledge our support for business to get behind that. So priority number 1, it's actually a very short-term one. We have to be able to do lockdown well. We have learned from Leicester that there has been confusion on the ground. We are going to have to be able to deal with short-term spikes much better than we've dealt with them so far. And I think it is a plea for every political leader across the country and across the North to work with business to clarify who's in charge, to be really transparent on the data so the economic damage can be minimized. So can we get that right and get good at it? Other countries are, we are not yet. Secondly, the focus of your conference today, Jill, on skills and the education transformation that we need, it has to be the top longer term priority, and it has to start now. At the CBI, we did a very important piece of work last year about the digital transformation and the fact that 9 in 10 jobs will need reskilling in order for them to be fulfilled. That has simply been accelerated by the pandemic. We know that in the North there are some specific skill shortages. We know, for example, Blackpool has significant digital poverty. One of the things we have seen during the pandemic is how vital those skills should be. We are going to get behind the Kickstarter program. That has to be delivered locally, because every business is going to need to think about providing a work placement that is going to take huge coordination on the ground. We need to get our colleges, our universities, unions and business, local resources, all working together on developing those skills and training packages that are going to help our young people build the skills they need in the future. We see a tremendous role for job centres to become skills centres. And actually we were delighted to see the Chancellor recognise that last week. So the point 1, we back everything you are trying to do, Jill, and everything that we know is happening locally to get the partnership between business, universities, colleges and local authorities to really get that skills transformation working for the North. But secondly, what kind of jobs are they going to be? And this is where building on the industrial strategy from pre-COVID and turning this into a recovery strategy built around this idea of building back better. We see at the CBI an opportunity for the North to become a global leader in clean growth ahead of COP26. We've got that opportunity at the end of next year that I think the North should be shining in. I really do. I mean, look at what is happening on Teesside and Humberside. We can have more offshore wind, developing sites for potential nuclear, including Cumbria and Hartlepool. Honestly, I think it is a jewel in the North's crown, and these will be fantastic jobs. You also hold solutions to the net zero challenges for the rest of the country. I believe you are innovators. Approaches to decarbonising heat, the H21 project in Leeds. These are all fantastic, and they must be accelerated coming out of the pandemic. HyNet in the Northwest, hydrogen being tested grab all these opportunities, build on them, and business will back them. So that's point 2, get ahead of the low carbon transition in the north. You have so many advantages here that will bring high productivity jobs, good green jobs close to home. Thirdly, closing that long-standing gap in transport and digital connectivity. I couldn't agree more with Judith on HS2. We will continue to back that. That must not get put onto the back burner. But that massive opportunity we now have around digital, full fibre broadband, look at the opportunity. If not now, then when? And I know we have Talk who are going to, and Tristia, I'm sure will say more about this, but we have fantastic telcos in this country ready and waiting to build full fibre, creating great jobs, boosting productivity. This could be the North's moment to really make this happen. The nationwide impact of full fibre broadband is £59 billion. That would be a dramatic improvement just when we need it most, and delivering that kind of inclusive opportunity for people to be able to work in their homes, from their homes, and again, helping to lift the towns and not just the cities of the North. Priority 5, accelerating investment in R&D across the North, innovation. We can take advantage, I think, of the fact we have the biggest single commitment from central government to boost R&D spend across the country that we have seen in 100 years. How that is used to distribute R&D spending across the regions of the UK, and particularly into the North, is a massive opportunity. At the CBI, we developed an idea called a Catapult Quarter, which is a digital and innovation hub bringing universities and businesses together. We think there should be several based in the North. For example, we think West Yorkshire, fantastic to see that devolution deal coming through, becoming a world leader in health tech, create a Catapult Quarter around that. Leeds City region, as part of its recovery plans, medical devices and diagnostics, really, really exciting opportunities. So innovation, creating high productivity jobs, and powering the North forwards. So a 5-point plan for rebooting and recovery, but Jill, I must end on just this clarion call around the power of devolution. I think it's interesting, if I look back to the beginning of my 5 years as Director General of the CBI, I think I would say that businesses had some ambivalence towards devolution. It wasn't proven for them. They were concerned about fragmentation. That has completely changed. And I think what you have now is a business community that recognises the power of local, is ready to roll up its sleeves and deliver it. And now we believe this is the moment to seize the opportunity to empower places. And the devolution white paper is going to be absolutely vital to that. We think local industrial strategies should become local recovery plans. Local leaders can be, and have proven themselves, trusted and able to be empowered to work alongside national government to deliver these plans. We think that there should be a doubling of metro mayors across the North within the next 2 years. We've called for 60% of England's population to be covered by a devolution deal within 5 years, but let's accelerate that. What we have seen over the progress of the pandemic in the last 3 months is 10 years of progress collapsed into 3 months. Why not do that around devolution and prove the power of local? So this is just, I think, a reiteration of a commitment that I think has been growing from the business community. We need Westminster to play a really powerful national role, but we need it to happen in partnership with local. We want to see, and if I can end with one plea to every politician who is listening, this is a time for economics and jobs and employment and skills training to be put ahead of politics. If there's one thing I hear time and time again from CBI members, is join things up, collaborate, act, move ahead. Don't get caught up in the power politics of local dynamics between different regions or the regions and the centre. act in partnership with business, and this could be such a powerful and transformative moment for the North. I'm very struck by analogies with the Second World War. There have been many, but one that has really struck me is that in the heat of the Second World War, when in 1942, when our young men were going to the front lines, Churchill commissioned the Beveridge Report. He commissioned William Beveridge to chart a new vision for the welfare state, for the NHS. Big things came out of that crisis, and big things should come out of this crisis. And I think one of them should be a re-empowerment, a new empowerment of the North, and business will back that every step of the way. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Carolyn. You're talking to the converted here. I think with all three contributions so far have actually worked very well together in terms of that spirit of collaboration, and that we are probably in danger of being in violent agreement. But I'm interested now to see, bring in Simon, who is another northerner from the other side of the peninsula, but further up, and from the northeast, Middlesbrough and Cleveland. But, you know, I want to listen to your answers to some of the challenges which have been posed this morning, but particularly around how we are going to really accelerate, reboot, rebuild and recover. I can't imagine what it's like in government at the moment, and but I do know this, that a regional response, a more local response would help. And I think certainly in recovery, I think that's what people certainly across the North will be looking for. Anyway, it's great to see you as always, Simon, so, and welcome. Over to you.
Thank you, Jill, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to Devo Connect for hosting today's summit. It's a pleasure to be joined virtually today by so many local government leaders, metro mayors, and of course members of the Economic Recovery Working Group with whom I've worked so closely over the last few weeks. We meet clearly at an extraordinary time, and thanks to the hard work and sacrifice of our entire country, the worst of the coronavirus pandemic is now behind us. But there can be no complacency about the ongoing health risks or the need to be alert, and there is vital work to be done to deliver a strong recovery and build a better United Kingdom. The debate on skills, education and employment has clearly never been more important, and I believe now is the time to pursue a clear, unashamedly ambitious strategy for growth, a strategy which protects communities from the worst economic effects this virus has wrought and offers a brighter future. The government recognises the enormity of the task before us and the unprecedented scale of support that's going to be needed as we shift from response to recovery together. It's time for action. Last month, the Prime Minister set out the £5 billion New Deal to rebuild public infrastructure, create thousands of new jobs, and help our regions build back and bounce forward. This was complemented by the Chancellor of the Exchequer's excellent summer statement last week. For the North, it means record investment in connectivity and transport, delivering Northern Powerhouse Rail and upgrading our road network, while also investing in digital and green technology so that we can lay the foundations for long-term economic growth. The Getting Building projects we're bringing forward in the north of England are doing exactly that. Projects such as the North Yorkshire Digital Infrastructure Programme to expand full fibre optic broadband to local businesses, while creating a new Internet of Things network to deliver the next generation of services for health, tourism, agriculture and highways. And in Cumbria, the Getting Building Fund is being used to create an innovative vertical farm, establishing the county as a centre for excellence in international research, while creating a new sustainable food supply to reduce the region's imports. However, we have to recognise that alone, government investment can only go so far in supporting the North's economic comeback. What matters equally as much is how we conduct the business of government. And as we deliver the recovery from COVID-19, it's imperative that we continue empowering local communities by devolving money, resources and control away from Westminster. Before the onset of coronavirus, the government, working side by side with local leaders, had made great breakthroughs, delivering the most ambitious devolution agenda for over 70 years. The parliamentary order has now been laid to unlock £900 million of investment for the Sheffield City region, while a new devolution deal, including over £1.1 billion of investment for West Yorkshire, was agreed and announced at budget. Once a new mayor is elected in West Yorkshire, 63% of people in the north of England will be represented by powerful and accountable metro mayors, many of whom join us here today. I'm a huge believer in this group of men, who I hope will soon be joined by strong female leaders too. And I thank them for their friendship, advice and support on a cross-party basis during this crisis. We want to see responsible and effective mayors representing 100% of the north of England, which is why, as we enter the recovery phase, we're pressing ahead with negotiations for new mayoral devolution deals in Cumbria, York and North Yorkshire, and Hull and East Riding, with a number of other areas in close contemplation and making rapid progress. I'm very grateful to the council leaders who are already working closely with my department on bringing these new deals to fruition. Delivering change is not always easy, but the prize for our communities and our country is enormous. I do not believe it is either right or sustainable to have the current asymmetry in our devolution arrangements, whereby the gap between those areas that have mayoralties enjoying the resulting funding and freedoms and those areas that do not will only widen unless and until we take action to address it. With that in mind, we need to provide local authorities with a clear blueprint to take forward their own aspirations for devolution. This September, the government will therefore be publishing the Devolution and Local Recovery White Paper, which will lay a clear path for levelling up every region of our country. It will provide a roadmap for establishing a series of new mayors within the next 10 years, representing the greatest decentralisation of power in our modern history. In our towns, cities, and rural counties, we will give local places the ability to come forward with new mayoral devolution deals which work for every community, allowing them to become masters of their own destiny. The White Paper will also redefine the way in which local government serves its communities by establishing the unitarisation of councils as a vital first step for negotiating these mayoral devolution deals in the future. A move to unitarisation will streamline the delivery of good governance, place local government on a more sustainable financial and population footing, inject more accountability into our democratic structures, and save money that can be reinvested into those communities. I say this very conscious of the immense contribution of all tiers of local government during this crisis. Unitarising at the right scale can preserve the best of district councils' strong relationship with local communities with the more strategic geography of the county councils. Several two-tier areas in the north, including Cumbria and North Yorkshire, are already considering reform, and my department wants to work with them in facilitating this transformation. The creation of more mayors and more accountability in our political system must also be accompanied by increasing the powers of the current mayors, putting local people in the driving seat by giving them greater influence over the services that matter most to them. The White Paper establishes the framework to fundamentally rewire the role of the state at all levels. Yesterday, it was described to me as a shift from MS-DOS to open source. Central government should set clear and ambitious benchmarks for success, but we know that local institutions will be able to complement this work and propel it to new achievements if we allow them to help design and deliver key policy programmes. That's why we've devolved the adult education budget to mayoral combined authorities, including £192 million this financial year to 4 areas in the Northern Powerhouse: Greater Manchester, the Tees Valley, North of Tyne, and the Liverpool City region. Pending the necessary approvals, the adult education budget will also be devolved to West Yorkshire and Sheffield City region from next year. The benefits of devolving this fund are already starting to show. mayors were able to act quickly in securing provider finances in the emergency response to COVID-19. They're also helping learning providers to innovate and adapt to the needs of local employers. Liverpool City Region's test and learn pilots for English, maths, and digital skills are a great example of this work. That engagement with local employers at a local level must also include a renewed focus on apprenticeships and the value they can offer school leavers taking their first steps into the job market. Pre-COVID, the North has consistently punched above its weight on apprenticeships and further education. The Secretary of State for Education recently gave an excellent speech about ensuring we promote vocational routes properly. And great as university is, end the culture that the only way to measure success is by the proportion of young people who go on to higher education. Around 35% of all apprenticeship starts are in the North, despite our region accounting for only 25% of the working population. However, the economic blow this virus has dealt means that apprenticeship vacancies have dropped by over 80%, and that's obviously created unique challenges for our region's employers. As the Chancellor announced last week, the government is urgently bringing forward over 1.6 billion to scale up employment support schemes, training and apprenticeships. Young people in particular are among the worst hit by the crisis, which is why it's crucial we give them dedicated and targeted support. We're therefore providing businesses with £2,000 for each new apprentice business hire under the age of 25. This is in addition to the existing £1,000 payment we already provide for new 16 to 18-year-old apprentices and those aged under 25 with an education, health and care plan. We're also tripling the scale of traineeships next year, doubling the number of work coaches to 27,000 and fast-tracking £32 million into the National Careers Service to help more young people access the high-quality training and skills they need during this challenging time. The Chancellor's plan for jobs also includes an incentive payment for employers who create new work placement opportunities, with £1,000 being offered per person for up to 10 learners. These are reforms which will bring real benefits to regional employers, such as Bentley, the Lloyds Banking Group, and Clark Energy, who stood by their apprenticeships and trainees in recent months, while helping young people to gain the skills, know-how, and most importantly, job experience to succeed in the local labour market. While we support the provision and take-up of apprenticeships, we must also increase our intervention in the early years of children's development and schooling, so that every child growing up in the North has the best possible start in life. As I know from my own constituency on Teesside, levelling up is at least as much about life chances as it is about infrastructure. In the last 3 years, the government has invested £90 million in 12 opportunity areas across the country to help young people overcome the barriers to academically flourishing. And this programme is already delivering impressive results in the 5 opportunity areas of the Northern Powerhouse: Blackpool, Bradford, Doncaster, Oldham, and the North Yorkshire coast. Over half the schools judged to be inadequate or requiring improvement in Bradford at the start of the programme have now improved by at least 1 Ofsted grade. And on the North Yorkshire coast, teacher supply and quality have increased, filling over 100 vacancies across 28 schools and securing more Teach First placements. In addition to these opportunity areas, we're also investing up to £24 million to improve educational and employment outcomes across 12 North East local authorities as part of Opportunity North East. This programme has a particular focus on secondary schools and includes building on the work of the region's 2 local enterprise partnerships to develop an enhanced offer of career support and business engagement for secondary schools. These are programmes which back local communities to build on their strengths while driving investment in all of our region's education providers. Because it's not just schools and colleges which have been hard hit by COVID-19. Home to nearly 30 world-leading universities and over 500,000 students, the North's higher education sector has, of course, also faced significant challenges in recent months. And yet many of them, including the N8 Research Partnership, have played a key role in helping the world to understand more about COVID-19, to examine how we monitor and slow its spread, and how we manage the long-term impact that the pandemic will have on our communities. They continue to play a central role in defeating this virus, so it's only right in the weeks and months ahead that we do everything we can to help these institutions, our 30 North Stars, to bounce back stronger. Last month, DFE announced over £280 million of grant extensions to universities and research organisations impacted by coronavirus. That funding includes supporting researchers' salaries and other research costs, such as laboratory equipment and field work. From the autumn, we're also bringing in a package of support for research-active universities, with low-interest loans covering up to 80% of a university's income losses from international students. This will help shield many of our northern universities from the worst losses they've experienced in the last few months, while helping them get back into the business of tackling the grand challenges of our time, from eliminating poverty and inequality to tackling climate change and helping the UK reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Even after the worst of COVID-19, the fundamentals of the North's economy remain strong. If the Northern Powerhouse was a country, it would have the 8th biggest economy in Europe. Our region accounts for nearly 20% of the UK's economic output and exports over £60 billion worth of products every year. We remain the international trendsetter in green technology, with Cumbria home to the largest offshore wind farm in the world at Walney Extension. That is, until it's relieved of that title by Hornsey Wind Farm off the coast of Yorkshire. The North is still recognised across the world as a great place to invest and to do business, with foreign direct investment doubling in the last 10 years, and Manchester retaining the title of the most attractive city for foreign investment in the UK outside London. In the months and years ahead, let's finish what we started and resume building a Northern Powerhouse with an international reach that matches the size of its economic and cultural might, a Northern Powerhouse built by the North and for the North. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And Carolyn already seems to have got one of your priorities already with the much awaited devolution white paper. Greatly looking forward to seeing that. And actually, you know, the key point today is that it's great to know it's coming, but it is around acceleration, how we can get things moving quickly. So I think it's been great to hear that sort of, you know, plethora really of you know, activity and ideas and thinking. I think the challenge for us today is how we get that moving, and if we need to, how the North responds. I'm going to quickly go over to Simon Bird and Tristia Harrison. Simon Bird's from AB Ports. He's going to lead our contribution or response to all the contributions that we've heard so far, which have actually been excellent, and then move on to Tristia. So Simon, can I bring you in now? And if I could also ask anybody out there who wants to put a question, please do use the chat. I'm not seeing any questions coming through. So if I can, or any comments, please do use that so I can try and bring you in. I'd also like our panel, Carolyn, Jim and Judith, to come back with any questions or thoughts in response to Simon, and then maybe Simon, you can wind up. That'd be great. So Simon, Simon Bird from AB Ports. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jill. Hopefully you can all hear me and see me as well. I'm sitting at the eastern end of the M62, actually in the port of Immingham, which is one of the 4 ports that ABP has on the Humber, Immingham, Grimsby, Hull and Goole, which together make up the largest port complex in the UK by tonnage. We're certainly on the outer fringes of the Northern Powerhouse, but nonetheless, taking Jim's point and indeed the Minister's point, we do punch above our weight and very keen to play our role in the debate about taking the North forward. It's very hard to disagree with what's been said, and I wrote down a couple of the key words. I mean, collaboration came across, ambition in terms of being clear where we're going and being ambitious about that, but equally do that at pace and accelerate that as we seek to capitalise on what the North has to offer. I'm heartened by what the Minister said in terms of devolution and that devolution white paper, but I would come back to what Caroline was saying in terms of the collaboration between the private and public sector. And as the Minister will know, in my part of the world over here in Hull, East Riding and North Lincolnshire, we do have some challenges around that. But also the focus on education and on apprenticeships, further education. We really do need to have the collaboration so that business has a voice in that, so that the new jobs that we can see coming through around tech, which are and decarbonisation, certainly over here in the Humber in particular, there are some fantastic new roles coming along that we need to ensure that the skills agenda and the education is geared to providing a pipeline of recruits for those new sectors as they come through. Look, in the interest of time, and I know we've got about 10 minutes. I want to, if I may be, a little bit parochial and ask the question of the panel around free ports. Free ports is being highlighted as a major government initiative. Can I ask each of Jim, Caroline, the Minister, really, where does free ports feature in terms of the list of priorities and the levers that can be pulled to create that economic activity that we're so desperately looking for in the North? Jim, perhaps you first.
Jim, if you could.
Sorry, Simon, I'm the classic. I stopped somebody saying, "Jim, you're on mute," so I managed to react at least that quickly. I apologise. Well, Simon, the fact that I didn't highlight it in my pre-prepared comments, to be candid, suggests to me that for the broad, long-term goals of true success of the Northern Powerhouse, which by that I mean getting rid of the productivity underperformance, I don't frankly regard it as important as education and skills initiatives, nor housing, nor technology. But I do think, particularly given Brexit, it's something that is worthy of serious consideration. You know, I'm in the camp that thinks there is still evidence needed to be provided that there is some actual economic benefits from leaving the EU. And I say that a day after we seem to be making further steps to deliberately distance ourselves from the biggest creator of economic growth in the world, known as China. So we've got to start coming up with something that's going to help our engagement with the rest of the world. And by using the opportunities that couldn't be pursued by being in the EU is obviously something we should be serious about doing. What I'm not completely convinced about is whether this simply distracts or takes away from other forms of activity that would be going on in any case into the free ports. That I'd like to see more evidence about, but it's definitely something that's worth serious consideration in my view.
Okay. Should we take that to Simon? Simon?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Good. Thanks for that, Jim. Can I ask Judith? I mean, we often, certainly on the Humber, regard Leeds as very much our part of our hinterland and part of the economic base of the wider Humber. Judith, how do you see free ports?
Unmute.
Sorry, sometimes we get a helpful prompt and other times we don't. I guess it's an issue that we haven't really got a full understanding of how it's going to work and what it's going to mean for other areas. But obviously, very keen to work with you on it. And in terms of the wider devolution debate, I think we've missed a real, I will repeat it and keep repeating it, that we've missed a real trick by not allowing the one Yorkshire devolution to go ahead. And I think we probably will come back to revisiting that before very long. I just worry about the bureaucracy of so many different establishments set up. And, we recognise the incredible contribution that the Humber makes to the whole of Yorkshire, and I think anything that we can look at in terms of enabling investment to come in, which will bring benefit to the wider region, you know, something really worth looking at. But we do have a port in Leeds, you know. I don't know if everyone's aware of that. So maybe that's something we could talk about, Simon, going forward, how we can make sure that actually we use this as an opportunity to look at all, you know, everything that we've got, all of our assets, and how we can actually work much better together. And you know, this is an opportunity for us to seize the moment and really, you know, I think as has been said, you know, there's no space now for anything to get in the way. We have to really focus on collaboration and how we can maximise the opportunities we've got to the benefit of all of our communities.
I'm well aware of Port Leeds at Sturton, on the canal that links it to Hull, or to Gaul, I should say. Look, in the interest of time, could I ask the Minister, who I know is keen on free ports and of course has a constituency closer to Tees than he does to the Humber, but equally to give us the view on free ports and what economic levers that enables us to pull to help drive the economy in the north.
Thanks, Simon. Yes, I am. I'm a big advocate of free ports. It's something which obviously I've been involved in very closely, as you say, in the PD port context for Teesside in my constituency capacity. But obviously, more broadly, the government is now looking at this question, you know, with great seriousness. The consultation on free ports, which was extended owing to the current crisis, closed on the 13th. But the core customs tariff and the core customs and tariff benefits, if I can splutter the words out, that we propose to offer to businesses bringing goods into a free port site are duty suspension, duty inversion, duty exemption for re-exports, and simplified customs procedures. And I very much take the view that we need a big, bold offer for these free ports to be meaningful. That is to say that there does indeed need to be meaningful incentives for business to relocate to those ports. The government obviously has a clear focus on preventing displacement as part of that. That would not yield net economic benefit for the UK. It's about winning business from abroad. It's about showing that the UK is gearing up to be an entrepreneurial free trading nation at the end of the transition period. And I know that this is something which, you know, senior ministers across government, from Liz Truss to Rishi Sunak, share a common ambition. So I think it's fair to say that we will look at this with huge interest and intent and look to bring forward proposals swiftly so that we can indeed recognise the benefits and ensure that this integrates with both our wider strategy for post-Brexit growth, but also with the levelling up agenda and the opportunities to use free ports to help stimulate parts of our economy and areas of our country where growth has lagged behind, if you like, the greater southeast. So we're very interested. We're looking forward to reading the consultation responses. And as I say, I think there is every intention to move at pace on this.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon, for your question. And I'm going to bring in Tristia Harrison now from Talk, the Chief Executive. A lot of talk earlier around the important role of digital and technical skills. So your question and comments to the panel, please, Tristia.
Thank you very much, Jill, and thank you to all the panel. I think it's been a fascinating discussion this morning. You know, from Talk's point of view, we are delighted to be involved with the Northern Powerhouse. As many of you will know, we took the bold step last year to close our office in London and to move our headquarters to Salford. We're delighted that we have done that. We employ, you know, close to 3,000 people locally in the area. The very heart of Talk started actually in Earlham, and our business has been very much in the Northwest throughout our relatively short period. I think in terms of this morning, I agree with much of what has been said. As you might expect me to say, we really believe that the digital infrastructure full fibre broadband rollout needs to gain huge momentum. And if the last few weeks through lockdown and the COVID-19 period is anything to go by, we can all see quite the demands that are going to be placed on the national digital infrastructure and broadband, with people working from home, running their businesses, homeschooling, downloading video, downloading gaming. You know, this thing, the genie is very much out of the bottle. The sad thing is that the UK and the Northwest and the North as a whole is significantly behind the rest of Europe and most countries globally on digital infrastructure and full fibre. I think the Prime Minister's clear aim to drive full fibre penetration by 2025 is incredibly ambitious, but incredibly important. And I think it was Jim that used the word boldness, or Judith that used the word boldness, needed from right at the top of government to make sure that we absolutely do drive that agenda, and we use the last 8 weeks and the exit from this pandemic as a further acceleration on this. In terms of everything that's been said, clearly we've been going through a national crisis, but a local response is absolutely essential, and we feel very strongly that the North ought to be at the centre of that. It does need action quickly. I think we have to be careful of avoiding talking shops, and I think we do need to collaborate together, private sector, public sector, local government, and we need to get on with it. I think there are 3 areas I would particularly focus on. I've talked about digital infrastructure. The foundations are there already. We shouldn't forget that driving fibre, both in terms of the build and the management and the migration of customers, drives jobs. It is a sector that has not furloughed one employee. It is a sector that is been open 24/7 over the last few weeks. It is accelerating now. That's true of the mobile networks, it's true of the fixed providers, and we need tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs right across the UK, and particularly in the North. So that's the first really fundamental point, which is the economic benefits of digital and full fibre are clear, but the very, very immediate re-employment of those that will sadly lose their jobs, and particularly amongst the younger age groups from hospitality, aviation, retail, etc., can very quickly move into roles in fibre infrastructure. The second area, we've heard a lot about it, I agree completely with Jim, it's around skills and education. We have to expand the brilliance actually of Manchester and the Northwest in terms of digital media and creative skills. That has to expand right across the North. It's fundamental. The work on apprenticeships is fundamental. From a business point of view, you know, all employers locally ought to be driving that significantly. And the third thing, again, we've heard a lot about this, is public-private sector collaboration and the importance of devolution. And I would echo Jim, I would echo Carolyn, I would echo the Minister that this is the time now. And I think, you know, businesses will share my view that, you know, we need to club together, come together, collaborate locally and make a difference exactly where we are. And I think, you know, the point that Simon makes around if the Northern Powerhouse area was a country, it would be the 8th largest economy in Europe. My goodness, we've got the opportunity to really exploit that. So, you know, I think today is important. Reboot, rebuild, recover. It's fundamental. We've got to be careful not to just talk. We do need to come together and drive some change. And I think digital infrastructure, digital connectivity, and this ambition for full fibre in the North should be right at the heart of what we do. And we are certainly delighted to be involved in that and to drive that incredibly quickly. Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, that's great, Tristia, and again, couldn't agree with you more. There's actually quite a lot of chat going on, surprisingly.
Great.
I'm very conscious of the time. We've got Andrew Bounds from the Financial Times, who also has been quite active on the chat and is very keen to ask you a question, Simon. So I'm going to bring him in, and then I'm just going to have a very quick one quick comment, thought from each of the panelists, and then we're going to move on to plenary 2, where if all the people on the chat just hold on, we will hopefully have more time for a discussion. Okay, Andrew, I'm bringing you in.
Thanks very much. I mean, anyone's free to answer this, especially Jim O'Neill, who's had who's had a lot of time negotiating these mayoral deals over the years. How many areas of the country do you believe will be willing to sacrifice district councils to have an elected mayor? Specifically for Simon, has anyone told the 1922 committee about the policy? How do you think it'll go down on the Tory backbenches?
Jim, do you want to go first?
All yours, Simon.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Andrew, for that question. And look, the devolution white paper is intended to be a big moment in what is an incomplete devolution story. It's about making sure that the right powers and funding sit at the right level in order to bring most benefit to communities. And clearly, we're going to be engaged in a wider conversation around this white paper as we move forward to publication, which will make it clear that it will be a precondition to unlock the funding and the freedoms that go with a proper devolution deal, that we do indeed move to a unitary structure. We believe that that can harness, if you unitarize at the right scale, the virtues of both the districts and the county councils. And that's reflected in the really good talks that I've been having this week with councils and colleagues across a range of geographies. And we're in a very good place now, in places like North Yorkshire, in places like Cumbria, in progressing those discussions. And we anticipate being in a good position to progress in a number of other areas very quickly too. Now, change is always challenging. I said that in my speech, and I'm fully conscious of all the sensitivities that go with this agenda. But we believe this has the benefit of actually better serving the people of the United Kingdom. In the end, the state should be structured so as to be as efficient as it possibly can be in allowing policy to be implemented at least cost and with least bureaucracy. And we absolutely believe that with a sensible, place-based negotiation, each deal will ultimately have its own unique facets, that we can deliver a policy that works for everybody. And as I say, we're already finding a real appetite now for good common sense collaboration and reform in a number of areas. So it's going to be an ongoing conversation. Obviously, I will be making myself available to colleagues across the House to take part in this discussion, but we believe it's the right thing to do. And we believe that the moment justifies the boldness. So there'll be no resiling from me on that point.
Judith and Carolyn, and then I'm going to, we're going to pass over to the mighty Henry Morrison. Okay, Jim, last comment really about being bold, and building back.
You know, I'm citing one firm or one comment or one person. Listen, what Tristia talked about briefly in the conversations I've had with her, we need tens more talks, being excited about being at some location in the heart of the Northern Powerhouse. And when that happens, it will be a success. And that's the kind of boldness we need from all of us to attract people and people like Tristia and her board to make those decisions. And job done when that happens.
Mute. There we are, Judith, sorry.
Yeah, I would just say we have to remember that devolution is absolutely in its infancy in England. We haven't got real devolution yet, and I'm sure the mayors that are going to be contributing later will say the same thing. So we, as well as the new areas, we need to look at the devolution model that we already have. We need to expand it to include fiscal devolution and to allow mayoral areas to have real freedoms in terms of addressing the needs of their communities. So welcome the fact that it is expanding, but we still have some really serious conversations with government about what we actually mean by devolution. I would just finish by saying, reinforcing what I said at the beginning, that accelerating is obviously something we want to see, and if we want it to be bold and ambitious, but if we don't address the social and economic disadvantage that we have across communities in the north all we will do is to reinforce those problems, and that won't help us move forward in the way that we need to really maximise the potential of the North and the contribution we can make in the future.
Yeah, that's great. And last but not least, Carolyn, last thoughts.
Terrific conversation. I mean, I think what comes out, the impact of the pandemic, devastating, but also galvanizing. You know, this language that we're now using of boldness, collaboration, and genuine evidence on the ground. We can build on the success of co-created job retention scheme, the collaboration at the local level we've had between business and local government, and now take it to a new level. And if I could make one request of the Minister to Simon, terrific to hear there's going to be a devolution white paper with such ambition. Can it be co-created with business and local communities so that it is genuinely something that takes us forward? We have such an opportunity here. I think there is such enthusiasm. I think there are, I think Tristia is one of a new wave of business leaders actually that is who are leaning in and want to really make this happen. But we do need to co-create it. It does need to be a partnership.
That's fantastic. We are running behind time, so I'm going to really just say, I think it's been a fantastic start to the day. Thank you all so much for so many insightful and thoughtful contributions. I'd like to thank Jim O'Neill. I'd like to thank Councillor Judith Blake, Dame Carolyn Fairburn, Simon Clark, who gave us, I think, some reasons to be cheerful, but it's not over and done yet if we are truly going to accelerate and get things done now. And of course, it's great to hear from Simon Bird, and also Tristia from Talk. So I'm now going to hand over to the mighty Henry Morrison, and thank you very much indeed for the next session, which again, sticking to the theme, will be not just rebooting, but now moving to rebalancing and recovery in the North. So over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Jill, and for a great morning session to all those who contributed. I think this has been a phenomenal day, and credit to Jill and her colleagues at Devo Connect for putting it together in what are very challenging times to be able to convene us all. I think in this session, I'm not going to go through some of the ground rules and how it will work, which Jill kindly did this morning, but I'm going to go straight into introducing our next session. And we are really lucky to have some incredible panellists joining us. Anne Longfield OBE, the Children's Commissioner for England, Lord Victor Adebowale, a son of Wakefield, of course, and a great friend to all of us here in the North, and Helen Barnard from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, based in York, and an organisation at the Northern Powers Partnership on issues like the future of European structural funding and the particular thorny issue of the Shared Prosperity Fund. Great collaborators working with us and our northern mayors on issues that don't just affect us, but some of the most deprived and disadvantaged communities across the country. So we're going to talk in this session about rebalance and recovery. We're going to be talking about the role that education, employment and skills play in that change that we need to bring in our economy, not simply going back to where we were before, but ensuring that we can build something back better, which was I think a Burnhamism, and Andy will be joining us later today, and I hope those of you who are able to come back after lunch will be there for the event and session with him as part of the youth panel, which I'll be doing later. So I'm going to go straight to introduce Anne as our first keynote contributor. Anne, the author of Growing Up North with her team, which I think was a really important intervention as an official national report by a public institution into the challenges that affect our young people growing up here and our children in the north of England, and those disadvantages and inequalities that we on at Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and Jim in particular, who referenced it in the last session, have been absolutely so keen to support Anne in making the case she has. Many of you will have seen Anne on your TV screens in the last few weeks, and clearly she has played a huge role in getting our schools reopened, but also making the case in particular for the catch-up premium, the disadvantaged support, which has become the national tutoring service that without her intervention and that of the number of Conservative and Labour MPs would never have happened. So Anna's brought home the bacon, I suppose, to here in the North very recently on these issues. She also joins us from down the road in Ilkley, so we've metaphorically moved from Jill in Manchester to this particular part and corner of West Yorkshire. So with a very much a Newsnight ready backdrop, which is a real house, not a faux for these events. It gives me real pleasure to introduce Anne to you all, and I know you'll very much enjoy the contribution she'll be able to make today.
Well, thanks so much, Henry. And yeah, it's a real backdrop, though I must admit I did paint this wall dark grey in lockdown, so there we go. But I've been doing this job, which is a fixed term period, for 5 years now, and coming from the North, having lived in London for 25 years, but coming back to the North as well, I really wanted to focus on what I knew and could see very clearly were inequalities for children growing up, and being able to kind of quantify those and present them on that national platform, as Henry said, was really my ambition. I'm really pleased that that report still has legs and played its part very much alongside other reports. It's 2 years since that report was launched, and what it showed, of course, is that there's lots of children in the North that are doing very well in school and have good life chances, and equally so as their children in the South, but really that there's a sizable number who aren't doing as well and don't have the same opportunities, and interestingly as well, talking to children as part of this process, don't feel they have the same opportunities as children living in the North. And what I used as part of that was to compare what had happened in the North in terms of education and children's prospects with what had happened in London, when actually there'd been a 2-decade programme which puts rocket boosters underneath the education system. And that felt very, very different. It achieved great things. Very, very different from the kind of scraps that people I met in the North and around schools told me they were still fighting to. And that won't come as a shock to so many of us that live and work in the North. It's some of the stats here. A child receiving free school meals in Hackney is 3 times more likely to go to university than a similar child in Hartlepool. There are parts of the North where you struggle to actually study A levels still. And for decades, I think what we all know is that the education system has been beset by inequalities based on income, race and region, and those same issues have held the North back economically and our children back for years. We also provided additional research we published last year about qualifications, and about what it showed was that there were many of the northern areas where actually kids were leaving school without basic levels of qualification. Again, to give you some numbers, last year in Yorkshire and Humber, 11,000 children left the education at 19 after 14 years in it, 14 years, without 5 GCSEs or the technical equivalents. And of these, 30% were on free school meals. And in some areas, that makes up more than half of the actual kids in those areas. And of the top 10 areas of the country where children leave without even the most basic level of qualifications, 4 are in the Powerhouse area: Doncaster, Wakefield, Leeds and Knowsley. Now, of course, that was 2 years ago and last year, and since then we've had a general election which has seen an immense change in the political landscape in areas of the North. But for me as Children's Commissioner, that shift really needs to translate into improved prospects and life chances for children growing up in all of those northern cities and indeed the northern rural areas too. So we've had commitments of infrastructure spending for the North, obviously welcome, and rail in buildings and roads and the like. But my argument is that that will only get you so far. What we need alongside part of that is billions that actually are going to tear down those economic and education barriers for kids. Last year, for instance, I met a young boy from the Northeast who told me he didn't know any adult who had a job. I didn't prompt any of that, he just told me. And not surprisingly, his own aspirations were low, and indeed optimism was low. So that was all before we had a pandemic. And those challenges are tough enough already, but when we factor in what's happened over recent months, I think it's tougher still. We've seen a lot of kids in lockdown out of school, and I think also a lot of children that were vulnerable going into the coronavirus crisis. And what that will have meant is that in every way their prospects will have worsened, especially so for disadvantaged children, including many children growing up in the north. Again, to give you some figures on this, in Yorkshire alone, more than 800,000 children a week would normally be in school or nursery. Well, actually 450,000 children in Yorkshire alone are likely to have spent more than 6 months out of the classroom before they go back in September. We know that closing schools was an important thing to do, but we have to face up to what that means and what the cost is for children educationally, but also in wider socially emotional terms. In many ways, my argument is about repaying those sacrifices those children have made to keep other people safe during that period. Certainly schools and teachers have been doing great things with many children that are disadvantaged. But there's one survey in April that found that for schools in the most disadvantaged areas, 90% of teachers believe that their pupils should be doing less than 2 hours learning a day. And that's been confirmed by 3 more studies. And many of those areas will be in the north, and indeed, there's about 1 million children that don't have access to the tech or broadband, so they can't get online in the first place. So these are the lost benefits children have from not being in school. The structure, the social emotional impact, and the education, of course. And I'm really concerned that children across the region will have regressed during this period and will now be at more disadvantage because of that time out of school. And we know that in a normal year that about 40% of the disadvantage gap education for kids comes about because of the 6 weeks holiday. So it's important to understand what 6 months actually does. And for children in families without the time, the resources, the space, or the knowledge for that level of home learning, they've been dealt what I think can only be described as a hammer blow. But we also know there are many more of these families in the north, and that's why keeping children out of school is going to hit many of the region's disadvantaged kids very hard. I'm really pleased that there's been now much clearer language about schools reopening in September, and I think it would be a national disaster if they didn't. But I am worried that actually a lot of parents still say they're not confident about kids going into school in September, and I think there needs to be huge efforts to make sure they have the confidence and the information they need. But getting back in school, kids in school will of course just be the basics, and I think, you know, my message is about that relentless spotlight in those areas of the north where we know that children were already behind, those areas of entrenched disadvantage. I've joined with a Northern Powerhouse team, been really pleased to do so, to push for cash for a catch-up premium for children who need it most. Some of that's been committed to, and I think that's very good news. But I wanted to be really targeted at those areas where children need it most. And of course, I'd argue that many of those need to be in the north. So I want to see those same rocket boosters now that actually we saw in London as part of London Challenge in the 2000s in the north. So the £1 billion of catch-up is really important, but in a way, it's about standing still. That it's to get back to where you were, and there are already a lot of kids that are already too far behind. So I want really a very clear spotlight and commitment to putting a spotlight on those schools in those areas of the country in the north that need that added investment to get ahead. which means extra resources. It means recruiting top teachers in those northern towns, tutoring for kids that are falling behind, and help for parents that are struggling to be able to provide that support. So closing the north-south gap for me, and north-south divide for me, means also closing that attainment gap between the richest parts of the country and the poorest northern regions. And that has to be a priority. No child in a mainstream school should be leaving without those basic qualifications after 15 years of education that I think most people take for granted actually exist, but for too many in the north, they don't. So let's invest in the early years to end that postcode lottery of services. Let's invest in speech and language to get kids ready for school and reaching the developmental targets that we know are so important in the north, going in school, not school ready, and identify those children importantly with special educational needs and really properly support and indeed fund their education. When they leave school, there need to be decent places for them to go, and this came up time and time again when we talk to children across the north. They want those opportunities in the north, which they don't often see. We need quality careers advice, proper pathways, good jobs, apprenticeships, something which we know that many areas of the north are very good at, or university. And also that move to attract big firms to actually invest in the areas of the north too. So in summary, I think there is, I hope, what I can see as an opportunity within all this to really build back better, if you like. But it will take an immense effort. It won't happen of its own accord. And I think we need to raise, as a country, our ambitions. But also in the north, we need to continue to shout, and shout constructively, yes, but firmly also. So if we're going to have a revolutionary electric cars being built, well, let's have them being built in the north. If we're going to train thousands of new NHS workers, well, let's train them in the north where people need jobs. Every child growing up in the north really deserves the same chance as those children growing up in other parts of the country and the southeast. And spending billions on those infrastructure really also needs to be matched by investment in children's futures, in the education and in those progressions that they really need. So it needs systematic long-term change, which gives every child growing up in the north a chance to do well, actually. So as we emerge from COVID, the task is harder than it was 6 months ago. It will take a sizable amount of effort, I think, also investment. But what I think needs most of all is political will, which I hope we can make happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and absolute pleasure to have you with us today. I now want to next invite Lord Victor Adewale to join us, and it's a particular pleasure to have someone who was with us at one of the early People's Powerhouse conventions, where he gave a barnstorming performance at the first of those events that was rightly formed as a reaction to some of those very stale panel discussions that were perhaps being planned elsewhere at the time at an early forerunner of this event, organised by a very different set of people that maybe didn't have quite the same values. So it's great to have him come back to give a similar conversation and a starter for discussion as he did that day. So Victor, it's a real pleasure for you to join us, and I think in social value, we'd be lucky in the north to have a number of businesses like our friends in Sellafield, for instance, and in the wider Cumbrian economy, who are taking social value very seriously as part of their recovery efforts already. And in fact, I think much of the recovery in Cumbria has been focused around a lens on social value, not just driven from within the third sector, but actually from within private businesses and through public sector businesses and organisations as well. So I think it's a really important issue in the North, and it's been put as a central theme of the recovery by many places and communities already. And I think particularly as we reflect on young people and on opportunities for those who may otherwise not get them to get into higher skilled and good long-term opportunities, I think it's particularly right to reflect on the role that social value may play. So, Lord Adebowale, a pleasure that you can be with us, and we very much look forward to hearing your contribution.
Thank you very much. It's been fascinating to listen to some of the earlier contributions. Sorry I couldn't join earlier. I wear a number of hats, all of them Yorkshire flat caps, and but this issue is relevant to all of them. I am the chair of Social Enterprise UK, and I will comment on the role of social enterprises. I'm also the chair of the NHS Confederation, and perhaps I'll start my remarks there. But I'm also a business person. I'm the executive chair of and co-founder of a company called Visionable. So I see myself very much in the business space. And indeed, I will have to leave this conversation to get back to the day job as executive chair of Visionable. I think this issue is mission critical, and you know, we're standing on a burning platform. I think it was smoking before, and COVID has set fire to it. And Longfield's remarks and the remarks of others, it seems to me, make that pretty clear. I also sit on the board of the Co-op Group, which of course is one of the significant employers in the North. And I would say, just en passant, that, you know, if more employers were more engaged in their local communities as the Co-op, I think we might have moved a bit further than we are now. You know, the Co-op has led school academies, education. So there's something about, it's not just having business, it's what business does that's critically important in this regard. So let me start with health. I mean, and I start with health because the Confed spent a year partnering with universities and the Academic Health Science Network in Yorkshire. And we published a report on the 14th of July called Why Health for Growth. And people don't talk about health in relation to growth, but without health, you have no growth. It's as simple as that, as COVID has underlined, you know, a number of times. Without health, you have no economy, frankly. And so we have to, it's important that we start there. And there are just some statistics that you should note as we go forward that are very relevant to the North. I've always believed, and I've always known, and I've sat and listened to politician after politician reference with increasing veracity, I suppose, the last few years about the levelling up agenda and why that, you know, want to do something for the North. If there are any politicians listening to this, you should note you have no choice. You know, people didn't lend you their vote. They gave you their vote in the full intention that you will deliver for them. And the burning platform is basically you're standing on it, and there isn't a plan B. We have to level up the North if we're going to have a cohesive country. But just to be clear, the geographical health gap in the UK is one of the widest among the OECD countries as it currently stands, and that was before COVID. There's a divide between the North and the South of England. There's a 2-year gap in life expectancy, and people in the North are 20% more likely to die early. In Yorkshire specifically, healthy life expectancy at birth is lower for men and women compared to the national average. Absence from work because of sickness is greater than the national average, and mortality rates are uniformly higher. Yorkshire has the second lowest predicted infrastructure spend in England until 2021. So that's an average of £767 per person annually, compared to 1,105 in the southwest, for instance. If you look at the figures available data 2017, Yorkshire saw the lowest annual growth rate in the UK for regional gross value added, a measure that captures economic activity, recording 0.7% growth compared to a UK average of 1.9. And this is all before COVID, and a London rate of 3%. The region's GVA per head of 21,000 lags behind the UK average of 27,000. And of course, the pandemic output and employment in the region are forecast to decline by more than the UK average. So we're looking at, Anne referred to it as a hammer blow. You know, I think the hammer's definitely wielded by four on this occasion, and we are really facing some horrific stats. It's very clear that what needs to happen in health terms, and you can't talk about health, as I've said, without referring to the growth of the economy. And it seems to me that there are a number of fundamental things that we have to do if we're going to link health with the economic resurgence, the Build Back Better approach to post-COVID thinking. We cannot allow 43,000 deaths across the country to mean nothing. We have to learn. We can't go back to business as usual, because business as usual got the North where it is today. And that's unsatisfactory, to say the least. So we do need to move in health research and development spending in Yorkshire and the Humber to address some of the health and economic inequalities. And you can measure that. We need to be doing that now. We need to be empowering local leaders. I note the discussion around devolution. We have to accelerate devolution of health, the integrated care systems that are being developed. We need to accelerate and empower them. There are green shoots of what they can do in places like West Yorkshire. We need to build on that and provide them with infrastructure and the resources to accelerate it. Empower local leaders with the tools to improve health outcomes and deliver an inclusive growth and wider prosperity. And it's worth noting in this point, and I hope people mention this, the disparity that we have between the North and the South is increasingly felt in minority ethnic communities. I mean, I often get asked to go on these panels because I am the ethnic minority community, but I need to tell you that this isn't an issue about ethnic minority communities. This is an issue about every community. So we have to pay attention to it because it affects everyone, not just those communities. We have to give greater priority to well-being in investment decisions. The reason why I talk about the co-op is that their approach to building business is about building well-being into the way in which they do business and the way in which they are successful and profitable business. We need to ensure that health is included as an outcome in all economic development policies. It's not health and economics, it's health and economics. We need to embed health as a priority for all government departments. No policy should be pushed unless it has reference to its impact on the health and well-being of the population as a whole. Development bodies and anchor institutions, and the NHS is one big one in the North, and there are many cities and towns in the North where the NHS is the significant and major employer, needs to be acting as an anchor institution, working together and align strategies to deliver inclusive growth on a place-based basis. We need to strengthen local supply chains so that for key health and public services, so that they're employing and delivering those jobs. We know that for every month that someone's unemployed, their mental health deteriorates. We know to strengthen the joint analysis and foresight between health and effective public policy. And we need those anchor institutions to collaborate. We need system leaders. It is no good health leaders only being concerned with the boundaries of their own front door budgets. They have to engage with local government and vice versa, because at the end of the day, it's public money, and you are responsible for ensuring that the populations in your places benefit from both local democracy and health. Just one word before I go. What I don't hear, and this worries me when we talk about employment, is what are the most successful business models for building jobs in places of stress. And I say this because as chair of SE UK, I know that social enterprises have the most impressive track record on employment. The UK's 100,000 social enterprises already employ 2 million people, contribute 60 billion to the UK economy. For every 100,000 of turnover of a social enterprises, 3 jobs are created. If you compare that with other business models, that compares to 0.66 jobs created for every £100,000 of turnover in the private sector. social enterprises are profit generating, they are part of the economy, they're not part of the charity sector in that sense, they are economic drivers. So we have to be evidence based. They also are more likely to be based in the most disadvantaged areas. If you look at places like Leeds and Bradford and Wakefield, they're the places that are growing the social enterprises that we are going to need, the businesses that we're going to need in the future. 1 in 5 social enterprises work in the most deprived areas of the UK, as measured by the index of multiple deprivation, and 2/3 of community-based businesses are in the 10% most deprived areas, according to a study done by the Liverpool City region. So we're creating disproportionately more jobs in the poorest communities, and sustaining at this count 600,000 jobs in the most deprived areas. Don't reinvent the wheel. Put tyres and pump up the air on the wheel that you've got. And in Yorkshire, that's social enterprises. Let's build an and economy that's better than the one that we had. Let's do that on an evidence-based principle without prejudice, and actually focused on the things that actually work. So I would conclude by saying that we things like the Northern Powerhouse have a number of tools that we know work. I think that everybody on this call has no excuse to be pessimistic. We're the lucky ones, right? We're far too lucky to be pessimistic. We can only be optimistic on behalf of those people who aren't so lucky. What we can't afford to do is set aside solutions that are known because of prejudice, and we can't afford to have the boundaries of our own organisations, certainly in health, be the barrier to building back better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor, and it's great for you to be able to join us and give those perspectives, wearing your multiple metaphoric flat caps. And now we turn to Helen Barnard, and in an environment with all our male Metro mayors, I'm often embarrassed to sit on panels with lots of people who all look and sound the same, alluding to some things that Victor was saying. It's good to have another woman that would be a great Metro mayor in some of the vacancies that are being created in the coming future, and that Simon was talking about in his remarks earlier. So without suggesting to Helen a new job direction, it was really important, I think, to hear from our friends at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, uniquely a clarion call, a voice in public debates from the North. And it's a real pleasure to have them involved today, talking about the national conversation we need to lead from here about how we deal with unemployment and poverty levels, and what levelling up and rebalancing looks like for those communities that have been worst affected, not just by the pandemic, but about the deindustrialisation of many of our northern towns, which took 2 or 3 decades to get to this point, but does not need to take 2 or 3 decades to reverse. And I think in a place where we seem in the north of England to have lots of conversations about left behind communities, we need to reflect, I think, very importantly on the similarities between many of our inner city communities and many of our towns, which are bedeviled by some of the same communities and groups who are long-term excluded from the labour market, but also from wider society. And I think it's why it's so important to have Helen join us today. And so, Helen, very much the floor is yours, and very much look forward to hearing your contribution.
Great, thanks very much, Henry. Great to be here. So I've been thinking back to the previous recession and recovery, because obviously this is very different, but I still think there are a lot of lessons to learn. And I think the biggest one for me is that after 2008, we had a recovery that concentrated on the volume of jobs, not the quality of jobs. And the result was a decade of stagnant pay, poor productivity, and rising in-work poverty. And that meant we entered this pandemic with more than 4 million workers caught up in poverty. And that, I think, is one of the things that have left both families and communities even more vulnerable and with less resilience to the health and the economic impacts of COVID. And what we've seen play out is that the impacts of COVID have fallen most heavily on the people who were already under the most pressure. So people in deprived areas, people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds particularly, being much more likely to die from COVID, tragically. And I think that we have to think about this when we go into this recovery. We have to make it a good jobs recovery. And that means that investment, job creation, skills, whether it's local or national, need to centre on creating good jobs and creating the roots out of low-paid, insecure work, which so many workers just are stuck in for the whole of their working lives. And that needs to be baked into all our interventions. So I don't want to see any infrastructure project get given the go-ahead unless there is a package accompanying it of skills, of training, of employment support that has a commitment to create good jobs and a strategy to say, how do you connect those good jobs with progression to the workers who are out of work or stuck on low pay? I think the other thing is we need a better plan for some of those groups of workers that we know are going to be most likely to lose their jobs and stay out of work or stay stuck in bad work as we hit probably the recession that's coming. Now, we saw a pretty impressive plan for young people in the summer statement, saw quite a lot of what many of us have been calling for, but there are other groups that face a similar scale and similar types of barriers, and we haven't yet seen a plan for those groups. So we need to think about what is the plan for older workers? What is the plan for Black and minority ethnic workers? What's the plan for disabled workers? Because each of those groups is at as great a risk as young people of having a very big and long-lasting impact. And I think there is a particular risk that the big job losses will come in sectors where those workers are concentrated. So retail, hospitality, those are likely to be the sectors that are going to take the biggest hit, while the new jobs potentially are going to come in sectors like construction, which are male dominated and tend to have far fewer workers from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, much harder to break into those often very good quality jobs for groups who aren't at the moment particularly well represented. So I think those for me are the missing bits of the plans we've got at the moment, both at a regional level and nationally. But I also think one of the features of this pandemic has actually been how strong our values have shown through. So I think all of us would have seen on a local level communities really taking care of each other. And we've also seen the government act, I think, faster and on a bigger scale than a lot of people would have predicted before we came into this. The scale of the job retention scheme it has been an incredible achievement, as have some of the other things that have been done around homelessness, around an uplift to universal credit, some of those things which I don't think most of us would have assumed would have happened. So what I think we need to do is carry that spirit and that ambition into the recovery, because we shouldn't be trying to rebuild at all. We should be remodeling and reimagining our economy so that we can embark on a decade that sees falling in work poverty, that sees decent pay, that sees rising productivity, and crucially, that sees all those things come to the parts of our country that were shut out before. So we know that in the north and in other parts of the country, in coastal regions, some of the southwest, that we saw whole areas where people really couldn't share in some of the prosperity which other places were seeing. That's where the levelling up agenda came from. But I think to make it real, we've got to have that focus on a good jobs recovery. And that is how we transform well-being, the prospects for our young people, but also the health. Good jobs are good for people's health. So we can work those things together to have a really remodeled economy to go into the next decade. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Helen. A really, really interesting discussion. And I'm really glad to now be able to bring in some of those who are going to ask to give their responses, give some different perspectives. I'd also really encourage those of you who are listening and watching to be able to join us through the chat. So please do start giving us your comments. I particularly wanted to go first to Sam Windett from INPEESS. Obviously, INPEESS have been a key part, particularly of the National Tutoring Service, alongside our friends and colleagues at some of our universities who are keen to be involved, like there's at Sheffield Hallam, but also most importantly the Tutor Trust, who are one of their organisations they work with here in the north of England. So very much an organisation with a foot in the regions here in the north of England, but also very much experts in delivering interventions that are targeted at some of the communities that particularly Anne was talking about. So really keen, Sam, to bring you in first, and then I'll go to both Elizabeth and to Neil to get their reflections as well. So Sam, very much the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Henry. What a great introduction. Thank you. Lots going on with NPEESS, national tutoring programs. But today, actually, because of this summit, I'm going to be focusing on employment and skills and young people. Helen actually mentioned the Chancellor's measures announced last week, particularly around young people and jobs. So my sort of comment and question for the panel is about that. We do know that the government has taken on board the huge scale of the jobs crisis for young people. I mean, it's enormous. The solutions that they presented in the Chancellor's Summer Economic Update last week were suitably large. They were quite large scale. We know in the North from our work at NPEESS on the youth jobs gap research that we did last year, we looked at every single local authority in the Northwest through that. And we found that actually in the Northwest as a whole, those young people who were coming from a disadvantaged background were more likely to be NEET than across England as a whole, taken as a whole. We also know that those young people who become NEET, not in education, employment or training, are very few of them are ever likely to escape that. So that really hammers home the importance of support for those. We know it's even worse for low qualified young people. So Anne focused on education quite rightly. Those who are low qualified in some local authorities in the Northwest, we found that they were being better off than better educated against their peers who were non-disadvantaged. So there were some really stark findings there, which has driven our work with the Youth Employment Group, which we've pulled together. We're on the Secretariat for that. 150 organisations all working together on this agenda, businesses, universities, colleges, across the North, across the whole country actually, and across the UK. So my question with these big schemes that have been announced, and you've probably been thinking about these as well, the Kickstart scheme, the sector-based academy placements, how do we make them work for those communities in the North? How do we get the combined authorities, local authorities, communities driving those responses and working with the government effectively? We need them to be quick. So there's a real urgency here. We can't wait until mid next year for these things to come in. You know, they have to come in now. So we need to be quick. We need to work together on these, but they have to be right. And they have to work for those young people in those communities and the businesses as well. Importantly, they have to be simple, effective, and we've got a short time frame. So I'll be really keen on the panel's sort of thoughts about how do we do that in the next few weeks that we've got. Thanks.
And just because Jill left us a slight time lag, I'm going to get all of those challenges from our respondents together and then put them to the panel on a very flexible basis. I'm not going to tell you which ones to answer. I'm going to let you all kind of pile in as you see fit. So I'll bring in Elizabeth next and then Neil, and then we'll get a round of responses from all of our remaining two speakers who've been able to stay with us.
Okay, good morning. What I wanted to talk about is the role of employment support providers in the good jobs recovery. I think what we saw last week with the Chancellor's statement was some really good headlines, some national schemes, but when we want to drill down, when we want to give people good choice, give them life chances, the best starting point is when people start to return to work, is to return to jobs that are sustainable and have progression. So we've seen a huge upscaling in Job Centre Plus staff, in work coaches, but the quick calculation and the maths that I've done, and this is not a national figure, is that people will have caseloads of over 200. That is a huge amount of people to be working with to get back to work. And I think that's where, if we're going to have a skills-led recovery, if we're going to really address issues in the labour market now, as we move into 2021 and post-COVID, we need some really good local solutions, and local solutions that are based on partnerships, bringing in a real range of employment support. So as Sam just rightly said, we really need to work on what those headlines last week meant. And I was really minded by something that Anne said about young people who don't have knowledge and experience of work. How are we going to make sure that they take up the best opportunities and the right opportunities through Kickstart? How are we going to make sure that at the end of a 6-month work experience placement, they progress into something that's going to be, really is going to kickstart the rest of their lives and give them real life chances? So you can tell from, I'm sure you can tell from my speaking, I am a northerner. I'm a Lancastrian who's sat in Yorkshire today. So I think that we really need to look at local economies, look at the opportunities, look at the green jobs recovery, and really, really think about how are we going to create the best jobs of the future, and then how do we support people to get them and to progress in them.
And finally, Neil, obviously a great thinker on issues relating to many of these topics, and a great friend to many of us on issues of economic development in our places. So Neil, it'd be really great to get some of your sort of responses to what the panel had to say in their opening contributions, but also any other thoughts you want to share before we open the discussion more widely on the recovery.
Yes, thank you, Henry, and delighted to be part of this. And I'm Neil from the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. I'm also, worth noting, not speaking that role today, but I'm also part-time seconded to the Scottish Government now to help with their recovery and reform process with a focus on community wealth building. I think my comments to the panel is about scale and veracity, really, and it links to what Sam and Elizabeth are saying. And I'm wary that, and none of the panelists did this, but I think some of the previous panelists did in the session I listened into, is there is assumption here there's a linear thing going on, that there's a crisis, and then we're going to come out of the crisis. I think that's mistaken. I think we're in a ongoing crisis, like a thunderstorm in the hills. It'll crash, and then it'll swirl around and come back again. And with climate crisis, yeah, I think that is going to be the case. It adds to that. And so there's an important point to hear about this is not about a linear in and out. We are in a crisis, and it's going to get more severe. And the public health crisis is not finished, of course, and the economic and social crisis has not really begun. I think Helen alluded to that. We're going to see massive business failure. We're going to see mass unemployment, which is worse, much worse than the 80s. And we're going to see, in fact, we're seeing it. We're going to see social destitution, potentially, because our local public services have been eviscerated and our local government have got a reducing budget. So we've got a hell of a task on our hands, unknown in 100 years, and we all have got to be part of that. And I also linked to that previous point that was made, I think, in the previous panelist. It's like a Victor. Nothing's ruled in and nothing's ruled out. Ideology, wherever you come from, if it means a little bit of hard interventionism, it needs a little bit of Marxism, or it needs a bit of laissez-faire economics, we've got to use all tools that we can possibly use. And just touching on very finally on scale, we're going to have to up the scale. And questions to the people, to the panelists really. People. This needs to be a people-led recovery. Yeah. That means, should we not be investing in early years to the same tune as we invest in Northern Powerhouse Rail? Would that not be a great investment in the future? Billions of pounds in early years. What about the everyday economy? We talk about high growth sectors. What about care? What about utilities? What about retail? Should that not be where the jobs rich future is? Should we not be investing in those very mundane things? Ownership of the economy, Victor touched upon it. This is a rich region. We should be thinking about how do we get our hands on that wealth? Social enterprises, co-ops, community enterprises. And finally, public spending. Every single pound that needs to be spent needs to benefit people and businesses of the North. All our anchor institutions have a massive obligation to ensure they procure from local organisations, local businesses. So it's all about scale for me. How do we actually build the scale under, in a sense, a Northern Powerhouse and a devolution agenda that is actually very limp and actually, as Judith Blake said earlier, something that's very, very poor. How do we create that scale of the challenge that we're facing?
Thanks, Neil. As always, stimulating, and as others who also suggested, spending an awful lot on early years. Much common ground, I think, certainly that I would pick up in terms of areas that I know many in the audience, I'm sure, would agree with as well. I was going to turn first to Anne, particularly to reflect on some of those issues, perhaps around early years, which I know is also a subject of which you are obviously not just a great campaigner and leader, but also an expert. So, Anne, I'll pass on to you, and then also come to Helen as well before we bring in some of the really interesting conversations we're having on the chat. But please, if you haven't already sent something through to the panelists, do share it so that we can bring in your voices as well.
Thank you. So on the, I mean, I was struck by quite a few things then around, this has to happen. And I think we're in the phase where there's a huge opportunity to make things happen, but also feeling that this has to happen. We've had this terrible crisis, we've had this real setback, and also is a sense that things can be reset in a different way. And I don't want to lose that momentum or that priority, but I fear that sometimes, things pass, there becomes a new normal, things settle, and it just carries on as it was, with a bit here and a bit there. So I'm really keen to use this point to actually reset and make things very different from where they were, and particularly around opportunities and the deal for the North. On the early years, it's really clear to me, and actually we have a report out this week in a couple of days on the early years. And whilst there have been some gains in early years and investment over the last 20 years, it's all been quite incremental, it's all been quite ad hoc, which means that the system is quite disjointed, despite the fact that there is funding in there for parents. It's not enough funding to make most parents feel that it's usable, or it's broad enough or coherent enough to support the things they need to do. And a lot of parents, I think, still feel that that's not support that they can make the most of. So I think there needs to be, broadly in early years, a rethink and a rebuild. But I think that actually, again, being able to pioneer that in some places in the North would be very, very welcome. We have opportunity areas in the North. I would be seeing that they would, I'd really want them to demonstrate what a focus on the early years can look like. And that coherence goes way beyond just kind of providers of early years and education. It also means you've got midwives and health visitors working coherently, family support working coherently. The ability to do that and wrap that into a people-led recovery and people-led progression is immense, and something that I think the North is very well placed to do.
Thank you, Anne. And Helen, do you want to give some reflections before we bring in some of the comments from the chat, and then bring this morning's session to a close?
Yes, so I had a few thoughts. I think on the young people and apprenticeships point, I think one of the things that's been very much on my mind is that coming into this, there was quite a serious problem with the quality of some apprenticeships, and that will not be of any surprise to anyone. There were quite a lot of apprenticeships around that were doing very little for young people's prospects. They didn't come with a lot of training. They were in jobs and industries without progression routes. And we had already had a bit of a problem of focusing on a kind of target for numbers of apprenticeships rather than a target for how many young people get better jobs and pay progression coming out of them. So I think there is a real danger, because of the urgency, that we just expand the number of low quality apprenticeships, which will not do what we hope it will. I think more broadly on skills, I think one of the interesting gaps in the summer statement was the government haven't yet brought forward the National Skills Fund, And I think that was a slight surprise that wasn't one of the things that they are going to do more quickly. I'm hoping that will maybe come in the autumn, because I do think that the gap for the over 25s and really focusing on skills and training for over 25s is vital. I thought Elizabeth's point about employment support is absolutely right. So it's great to see the investment in Job Centre Plus. It's the right kind of scale. But actually what we have quite a lot of evidence of what really works to get people in good jobs and keep them there. And a lot of it is about high quality, independent organisations providing brokerage services. And there's been a real kind of pulling back of funding in the independent employment and support sector. We're going to need to build that up quickly. The other big gap, I thought, in what's gone so is we haven't got a programme of building more social housing, which seems like a really obvious thing. We know we need to do that to bring down housing costs. We know we need to do it to bring down homelessness, and it would be a very good economic stimulus. So I think that's something that I would love to see. And I think I'm hoping that we will finally be coming to a moment of reckoning for social care, that coming out of this, will this create finally the level of political will and public demand to sort out social care? There's an awful lot that needs to be done, but one of the bottom lines is we just as a society have to pay more for it. There's no shortage of models and policies and ways to do that. It's just no government in recent times has managed to find the kind of political alliance to get that over the line. And I think, everyone was out clapping on Thursdays. Most of the people who were clapping could really do with earning enough not to have to go to the food banks. And we need to change that. And I'm hoping this may finally be the time that we achieve that. I think I'll stop there because I'm sure there's lots of other questions. But I think coming back to the idea of it's not just about volume, it's about quality, and we can't sacrifice quality for speed, which is, I think, always one of the risks in this kind of situation.
No, and I think those are really poignant reflections, and they certainly tie in with some of the comments we've had on the chat and some of the questions we've had. And I think you anticipated a question that Tracy Fishwick from the People's Powerhouse, but also from the sector in the Northwest in terms of the voluntary sector, raised around kind of the need for care. And there was another question that we haven't, however, managed to address as effectively as you managed to preempt Tracy's, which, as we're running low on time before people's virtual lunch, we are kind of trying to jam in as much as we can. The question from Graham Duxbury to the panel was around the Chancellor's measures from the DWP about the overnight unemployed, and clearly the large numbers of those who have essentially now probably potentially been unemployed for the first time in their lives. Clearly, ourselves and Helen have worked before on those that are currently supported through European programmes, and I mentioned those at the beginning, and there's a lot of uncertainty about that future. But of course, they're now at the back of a longer queue, which I think is a really good point that Graham makes, and certainly responds to the discussion we've been having. I know a number of our contributors, as well as particularly Helen, will have something to say about that. So I was going to bring in Helen and then any of our other contributors that want to answer Graham's really good challenge. And then as I desperately search for the next woman and first woman Metro Mayor, I'll maybe turn to Anne Longfield as our most prominent West Yorkshire resident, at least in this particular session, to demonstrate the types of outstanding voices from leadership and policy that we have on our doorstep here in places looking for future leaders. So I'll bring in Helen first, and then I'll turn to you. I think Samantha, I know you indicated, and then I know Neil, and I'm sure Elizabeth will want to quickly say something, and then I'll let Anne kind of finish the session for us and give us a bit of inspiration and fire in our bellies around these issues as we kind of continue to debate and move forward here in the Northern Powerhouse. So Helen, if you want to go first.
So yes, I think it's a very good point. I mean, I do think the government is right to have a focus on people who are falling out the labour market, making sure they don't become long-term unemployed, because if that happens, they will find it much harder to get back to work, and it will put even more pressure on services. So I think that's right, but you're absolutely right. The people who were already struggling are going to be pushed further back. And the people who had the weakest labour market attachment, so those who are in insecure, low-paid jobs, kind of bobbing in and out anyway, are the people most likely to end up out and not get back in. And I think that's why I think the Kickstart Fund is, that kind of model is fine for young people, but we basically need the equivalent for these other groups of workers. And we need to have that linked up then to all the infrastructure spending and all the other job creation. It all needs to be linked together so that the people who get access to those new jobs, it's in the places where unemployment's going up and there are fewer vacancies. So we need geographical targeting, and we need specific employment services, which are creating a pipeline of people's skills and the training to get the new jobs that are being created and to keep them. So support to make sure once people do get back in, they keep that work, because that is one of the things that happens to the workers who are most disadvantaged. They are the ones who don't stay in work, who cycle in and out. So I think that's right. I think it needs to be as well as the focus on the newly unemployed, just to get those people back in as quickly as possible.
And Samantha.
Yeah, thanks. And absolutely agree with Helen and Graham's, the premise of his question. Graham and I are working closely together in the Youth Employment Group, specifically focusing on those young people who could be pushed further back in the queue for support. We know that the Kickstart scheme is intended for those deemed long-term unemployed or at risk of long-term unemployed. But there is a chance that those young people falling out of the labour market quickly come to the front of the queue, as you say, pushing the others back. But in our conversations with the government this week, we've got a lot of thoughts around that. I'm really keen to work with people, particularly combined authorities, local authorities and others, to think about how do we leverage that government money on the table. And it feels like there's a very open conversation here to be had, and a positive one. So if there is an amount of money on the table, how do we use that to then put in additional funding for wraparound support? How do we work together to pool that? Obviously knowing there's not a magic money tree for everybody, but how do we provide that support for those young people who need more support to get into jobs? I think there's a great opportunity for us to work together around some of these specifics.
And Elizabeth, before I bring in Neil.
Hi. Well, I totally agree with the point that Graham's made, and in fact Tracy, who I'd love us to be able to bring in. I think one of the things that employment support providers are saying they're finding is that there are a number of new claimants that are very easy to get back into work, who are really ready to get back into work. But there's also been quite a big shock of new claimants who just don't have job search skills, who perhaps had the same job for the last 20 years, and a job that may never exist again, and that are also presenting now with mental health and other health issues. So we've got to really have enough resource for those new claimants without stopping the work that we were doing around that old cohort of long-term unemployed, the health and disability work. And also the whole piece around the engagement, which we've seen through National Lottery funded provisions for partners of claimants, for women, for people that weren't on the Job Centre Plus radar until the introduction of universal credit. And I think we've got to remember that conditionality's back, and that everybody who's claiming will be being expected to look for work. So we need the money, we need the resources, we need the full range of provisions for everybody.
And Neil, did you have any reflections on that theme, or anything else you wanted to say before we pass over to Anne to finish?
Yeah, very quickly. I think that the question of scale and the scale of the job losses, it's not enough just a job scheme getting people into jobs. We need to think about the economic sectors, and there's going to be massive job losses and massive reduction in economic activity. And that means then we need to think much seriously about the actual supply of jobs. And that's why we've been calling for a state holding company or a city region holding company to take equity stakes in distressed businesses. And this is not the 80s, this is not a decade ago. This is a quantum leap in terms of the issue of unemployment and scarring. And it needs significant public work schemes, significant job schemes far beyond what has already been outlined by the government. I suspect DWP will be completely overrun and unable, that bureaucracy will be unable to deal with the crisis as it stands and as it moves forward. And for sure, there's no doubt that those job schemes will not be enough as they presently stand to deal with the crisis. They're going to have to get a bigger and stronger scheme, and I hope city regions are at the core of those bigger schemes.
Well, and of course, Neil, it's still not clear whether city regions may play a part, for instance, in the delivery of the Kickstart scheme, and certainly we will be making that case, as we have also, as NPP, made very similar representations around taking equity stakes, the opportunity for regionalised delivery. And I know Jim, who was with us earlier, and Howard Bernstein, I think, wrote a paper about that a couple of months ago now, to be honest. It's been kicking around a while, but also the opportunity to invest patient capital in newly formed businesses, because I think the challenge is that in some sectors where businesses cannot be saved, how do we create the same number of new high quality jobs that we can then get people into as those that cannot for whatever reason be saved? And that trade-off in the north is that we may see more businesses that are not fundamentally rescuable, and so how do we invest more in new business formation and scaling up existing businesses to compensate for that? Because I think there definitely is a degree of regionalisation in the number of businesses that might, for whatever reason, not be considered rescuable and may not have a fundamentally secure business model going forward, which in the end I think will be the only conditionality we should apply for equity stakes. Is this business actually viable in the not just in this period but in the future? And that's I know a debate I'm sure we'll have another time from your face, which I know we'll have the opportunity to do. So Anne, I like always, I've almost got us back on time. Normally it's me that's reading who are late, and this time it was the minister and others, so we're not to blame for delaying into people's virtual lunch. So I'm going to give you as long as you want, Anne. I won't. And then Jill will either cut us off or not, depending on when the virtual lunch break needs to come. But if you are waiting for your bowl of soup or sarnie, please do hold off for just a couple more minutes. I think we need to get those actions and a sense of impetus around what we want to do next, which I think is really important, Anne, for you to give us. And I know you'll have some thoughts on that.
So, as well as everything I've said about children and all of the action points around them, I think one of the things that this whole pandemic has managed to kind of move on is the fact that people have understood, the public have understood, I think in a much clearer way, what vulnerability is. So I've talked about vulnerability in my role for the last 4 years, and it's sometimes seen in concept terms, it's sometimes seen as something that other people experience, or indeed sometimes other people have, which sometimes gets implied that, you know, it's their own fault. But actually, I think what we've had over the last 4 months is a greater insight into what vulnerability brings in life. Mental health, for instance, domestic violence, economic disadvantage, all of the things which suddenly applies to a lot more people now than people thought it did just a few weeks ago. And I think that really underpins a different public mood, which I think is very possible we could hold on to, which really backs a much more inclusive approach to what we want to see in place. I agree completely with the comments around the scale of the challenge needing to be reflected in the scale of the response. And with that, I think there's a real opportunity not only to go for proper growth that has depth and roots, not just kind of the easy wins or the kind of immediates, but proper long-term reset, which is strong on economics, strong on infrastructure, but really has that depth of human and community growth in capacity too. I think all of those are really possible, and if anywhere could do it, I think these northern regions could do it. So actually, that, you know, we get to the point where everyone can feel that they have a chance of progression. I think the notion that actually it's okay to have some kind of system where we allow a section of the population not to feel that progression is something they can have as part of it, then is gone. So I would say with all of these things, the scale, the nature of the rebuild and the ambition with the rebuild, but also there's something I think about the North doing it for themselves. We shouldn't just wait here for how these proposals are going to come along. I don't think we should necessarily, although we will do it, look at how they can all be knitted together into a coherent whole. The people who know what is needed are the kind of people we've got on the conference today, those who are living and breathing and dealing with these issues day in, day out. So what I always say when I'm kind of visiting a city area and talking about that progression, but I think we can do it across the whole piece, is I don't think we should wait for others. I think we should map out what is needed. We should map it out, we should cost it, we should look at what's already there and what's been committed and how that can be worked. But I think the challenge back is, if you want, which I would challenge anyone to say they didn't, the region to be high functioning, successful, and everyone within it to really have good prospects, this is what it will take. So we map out what's needed, we actually look at what it will take, and then we challenge those with the ability to make not only the investment and commitment there to do so. And so take the front foot, I would say. And I think, I'd be up for doing that alongside others.
The virtual clap, and unless Jill tells me that we've had paninis and sandwiches delivered to every home of every participant, I think it falls to me to pass over to Jill very briefly before we let you go and get something to eat before we reconvene at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, I was just going to say very quickly, Henry, thank you very much, everybody. I think it was an excellent session. It's great to see you virtually. There is only a virtual lunch, I'm afraid. I can't I can't deliver to you by this means. But I just wanted to remind you at 1 o'clock we've got Andy Burnham and 3 fantastic young Northerners to talk about jobs, job skills and education and future life chances. So that'll be an excellent session with Talk and Henry, you're on again, I'm afraid. And then we go straight into 2 mini summits. One sponsored by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So we're going to drill down into this morning's conversation and looking at that. And also on the broader economic side, we've got Mini Summit 2 with the Association of British Ports. That's very much about the economy. I'm delighted that we've got, for both sessions, we've got Lord Heseltine, we've got the 2 Metro Mayors, Steve Rotherham and James